Hi, I'm Jay, and welcome to the very first entry of Catching Up with Games. Assassin's Creed is a series that needs no introduction. It is one of the most prolific franchises in gaming, which officially reaches adulthood in a few months. Not many series can boast about the same number of releases in such a short span, and while it hasn't been the smoothest of rides, it still commands a strong presence in the industry. As the title says, I will focus on the latest entry in the series, Assassin's Creed Shadows. But before we dive in, I want to provide a bit of background. This is my first Assassin's Creed game, ever. I have not played any of the earlier entries before. In fact, I've been avoiding them for a long time now. Not just playing the actual games, but also checking reviews, watching playthroughs, or any other piece of media that could spoil the experience for me. Naturally, I've picked up a few things here and there. It is pretty much impossible to be into video games and not stumble into some of the basics. To be clear, it's not that I dislike the series or anything, I just really hate spoilers. Perhaps I'm weird, but I have this chronic aversion to learning too much about certain games because I might play them one day. This has worked well for me thus far, but it came with a heavy cost. By actively avoiding being spoiled, I'm often left out of the conversations surrounding the game. I guess the natural follow-up to this is, yay, why are you so late to the party? Well, while my family owned some consoles and a PC growing up, my actual last console was a GameCube, and I wouldn't get a gaming PC until around 2015 or so. Now, it wasn't until a few years ago that I was able to purchase a Nintendo Switch, a PlayStation 5, and an Xbox Series X with the intention of playing not only the newest releases, but also all the ones that I'd been stockpiling on my wishlist for years. I have missed a lot of games in the mid-2000s, particularly console exclusives, and even before that there were many classics that I never got to play. Well, now that I have the means, I can finally start experiencing all those games. Unfortunately, there's one thing that I didn't take into account that has come to bite me in the ass. Something that I'm sure many of you in the 30s and up will be able to relate to. I can finally start catching up with all those games, only to find very little time to do so. Between my regular job, running errands, doing house chores, walking my dog, and spending time with my wonderful family, gaming time has become a premium currency, rare and hard to spend. Hence why I'm focusing solely on AC Shadows rather than the whole series. I actually ran some numbers, and according to how long to beat, it will take me around 392 hours to beat all the main Assassin's Creed games, and that's if I rush the main story and ignore all the DLC. At my current rate, that's between 5 to 7 months, depending on how greedy I want to be with my free time. So yeah, since there are many more games that I want to play, I jumped straight to the latest entry. But why specifically Assassin's Creed? I haven't played any other game in the series, nor do I have a particular fondness for it. I haven't even watched the movie, which I hear is remarkably forgettable. In fact, there were many other games I could have chosen, short ones even, so instead of having to choose between a game in the series, I could just cover them all. Well, there are two reasons. When I first came up with this video idea, AC Shadows was about to drop, so it felt fitting to start with a recently released game. And honestly, my estimations on how long it would take to write a script and edit the video were way off. But more than that, AC Shadows is a captivating entry for me. If you've been around for some time, you will know that the 2010s were full of gamers begging Ubisoft for an Assassin's Creed set in Japan. Assassin's Creed with ninjas easily charted the top of many wishlists. So much so that to finally be able to play it makes me a bit nostalgic about that era. On the other hand, I was also curious about how Ubisoft's situation will unfold. The last few years have been particularly rough for the company, and many rumors about a potential buy were circulating for a while. We now know that, while it wasn't completely solved off, Tencent has acquired a juicy part of the pie in the form of a subsidiary company that would handle their more premium franchises, including Assassin's Creed. What will come out of it? Will this revitalize both the series and the company? Well, judging by Ubisoft's latest earnings reports, it's likely that AC Shadows wasn't the economic miracle they hoped for. So where things will go from here, only time can tell. So, without further ado, let's catch up with Assassin's Creed Shadows. What can you expect from the 14th entry in a video game series when you haven't played any of the previous ones? When I got my copy of the game and decided to start this project, I was well aware that my experience couldn't be measured against someone who has played any previous Assassin's Creed entries, and that I would have to be confined within the boundaries of this game alone. I had to begin working on the foundations, even if it meant starting the house from the roof. So what are those foundations? Well, there were certain things I expected from an Assassin's Creed game. Stuff like the parkour, the stealth, the whole Assassins vs Templars narrative, or the futuristic frame story. But after spending dozens of hours with the game, I am genuinely surprised by how removed these elements are. It's not what I expected at all, and while I get that changes happen, particularly in a series as prolific as this, it still left me wondering about the identity of the series as a whole, at least going forward. For starters, Assassin's Creed Shadows is an open world game through and through. I knew this from the get-go. This series had adopted this format with Assassin's Creed Origins almost a decade ago. Sadly, there's nothing novel about its implementation, no unique flavor that I could attribute to it. When I was dropped into the world, I had the usual fare for this kind of framework. I could go pretty much anywhere I wanted, parts of the map were unlocked either by traveling or climbing the now world-famous Ubisoft towers, and to travel from point A to point B, I had to pass by so many map markers sprinkled in between. It's nothing I haven't seen before. In fact, one of my initial reactions to the game after finishing its lengthy tutorial was, it feels like I've played this game already. Which I had, in a way. Of the last 4 games I finished before Age Shadows, 3 of them either were or heavily leaned on the open world formula. They are Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, Horizon Zero Dawn alongside its Frozen Wild expansion, and perhaps most importantly, Ghost of Tsushima and Iseki Island DLC. And in case you're curious, the fourth one was Alan Wake Remastered. From this list, Ghost of Tsushima is perhaps the very point of reference to hold side by side against Age Shadows. When it launched, people were already hailing it as the Japanese Assassin's Creed game Ubisoft ought to have released years ago, something which I'm sure influenced their decision to go along with Japan for the next release. Not only that, it was receiving praise left and right both for its memorable story and its wonderful presentation of its Japanese aesthetic and narrative elements. Structurally though, both games share the same foundation. The difference lies in the floor plans, to keep up with the metaphor. Ghost of Tsushima goes for a more personal touch. It's less of an open concept with more nooks and crannies that guide your experience throughout the game. The story is more direct and personal, and the end result is a more focused game, both narratively and gameplay-wise, despite also falling into the same open-world trap where you are swamped by markers and constant smaller activities that pull your focus in a dozen directions at once. Age Shadows, on the other hand, is quite expansive, and every element blends in amalgamation of design, gameplay, and direction with one clear purpose: to keep you playing as long as possible. Throughout my playthrough, there were many times where I felt that the game had been engineered, for lack of a better word, to be played in short bursts. This is called a gameplay loop, and it's perfectly normal to have one. My main issue with it is that it felt artificial, repetitive, and it didn't leave a lasting impression. In more than one way, it reminded me of a mobile game, particularly when you realize that there is an in-game currency in the cash shop. In some aspects, I wondered if I would have enjoyed the game more if, instead of an open-world game, it just had a mission select screen. Since the gameplay is fun enough, but there is so much downtime in between loops that, by the time I got to the next destination, I was already bored. Perhaps I'm old school, but to me, an open world game means having the liberty to traverse the world and be rewarded by it, like it happened in games like Oblivion, Skyrim, or the 3D Fallout entries, just to name a few, where going from point A to point B will be an adventure in and itself, since I kept finding unexpected stuff in between. Unfortunately, Assassin's Creed does not agree. Nor does Ghost of Tsushima or Horizon Zero Dawn for that matter. It is the way open world games are structured, thanks in no small part to other Ubisoft games such as Far Cry. Age Shadows' world does not guide you toward finding these areas away from the roads, and rarely rewards you when you wander off anyway. The only one I can even remember are the animal drawings, which is such a lackluster event that I didn't bother with them after my third or fourth one. Age Shadows also feels like a step back in terms of navigation, especially when compared to Ghost of Tsushima. In the latter, if you wanted to know where your destination was, You press the button and the game invokes the wind, and a stray gauge will point you towards your current destination. It is subtle and elegant. In Icy Shadows though, they are displayed right there on the screen, along with how far they are, and much of your traveling is done by looking at these markers rather than the scenery. There is no sense of discovery, and the game is so bent on preventing you from wandering off that even in-game tips warn you about many off-road paths being dead ends, and that you should be using the on-rails GPS system. At that point, why even bother? Ubisoft has filled the game with beautiful scenery, but if you're just supposed to follow the white line until you reach your destination, then there is no point. A few weeks after its release, Ubisoft added the option to turn on autopathing, so that your character will move without requiring any input from the player. I guess that way you are granted the freedom to do the hell you find more interesting than staring at the screen for 5 minutes while making your way across Japan. It doesn't help that most villages and towns you come across feel barren. Well, the graphics are gorgeous, I agree with that. This depiction of Japan is beautifully rendered, and when it hits right, it's truly something. You can tell that there's been a lot of effort in the coat of paint. The world is a beautifully crafted prop. Beautiful, but still a cardboard prop. Most places lack personality, a breath of life to make them feel more than a couple of buildings scrambled around the main road to give the impression of society. It does a trick, sure, but the moment you notice it, the illusion wears apart. When I think of earlier Assassin's Creed entries like Unity or Syndicate, or even all the way back to the first entries, I picture the main character firmly within a recognizable city, climbing recognizable landmarks, and a place filled to the brim with characters, even if they were faceless NPCs that only served to fill the streets. The characters made sense within the constraints and boundaries set by the environment, whether it was the looming walls of Victorian London or the alleyways of the medieval Holy Land. In Shadows, though, that feeling is completely lost. Cities and towns are routinely a line of single-story buildings that leave very little to the imagination because, well, you can see for yourself even when you're standing on a roof, you are barely above any passing villagers. Only the mightiest castles, of which there are very few, or temples, which have a major issue that I'll discuss a bit later, feel appropriate enough. Taking the open world route took away from the strong sense of place that a more focused design could have achieved, one that I was hoping to get from this series. During the game's pre-release marketing push, I recall seeing the title of an article that proclaimed that Icy Shadows, quote, didn't want to hold the player's hand too much with icons and markers, unquote, and that the developers wanted to craft an open world where information was key and would become a form of reward. So, after I finished the game, I looked up Ubisoft's blog entry and I couldn't help but shake my head in disappointment. It is true in the broadest way possible. Instead of a marker when initiating a quest, the game provides you a vague idea of where to begin searching. You have two options: do the dirty work yourself or send a scout to that particular area and automatically uncover all markers in a given radius. The more scouts you use, the larger the radius uncovered. That would be great and all if it wasn't for the fact that Ubisoft kinda half-assed it. The description provided in the vast majority of cases is as subtle as a neon sign. It always followed the same format. First, the regions you have to travel to, then any prominent city or town nearby, and usually along with a cardinal direction, like north of X town. And then, and I kid you not, it actually gives you the location where the person is, whether it's another smaller town, a camp, a temple, a bridge, whatever. What is even worse, it feels like the developers forgot that they gave you an X-ray vision through which you can locate nearby collectibles and mission objectives. So I have to take a short stroll into the general vicinity of a location while pressing Alt-2 until I spot a blue ring, and voila, I'm there. But I guess if this is too immersive for you, then you always have the option to head into the map and press a button to reveal the exact location. And you know what? That's what I did every time anyway, because that way I could simply use the auto-travel feature instead of wasting time. What else am I gonna use the scouts for? Smuggling resources? Sure, I could, but the hideout management part is truly bare bones and hardly worth the effort. The call for exploration, as Ubisoft calls it on the blog entry, fumbles the most important aspect of what exploration entails, which is a sense of wonder that urges you to head into the unknown. There are no hidden clues to piece together, no prior investigation required, no interesting twists to the formula or anything to suggest that the developers gave this system more than 2 seconds of thought, which is a shame. So, I didn't particularly enjoy the open world part of the game. However, the popularity of these sorts of games usually mean that each loop is sufficiently satisfying on its own, gameplay-wise, to keep you coming back for more. In that regard, I do think that Age Shadows has a serviceable gameplay cycle, albeit a simple one. The bulk of your activities will be, you guessed it, assassinating targets. This is a part where I think I was more disconnected with how Assassin's Creed is supposed to play out. I thought that the series encapsulated the assassin fantasy by combining parkour and stealth elements. But for the 14th iteration of this series, the game is much simpler in both ways than I expected. There is nothing here that I hadn't seen before, and I don't mean like 5 to 10 years ago, I mean in PlayStation 1 games like Tensu, and in that game at least I was able to control the hookshot. I just kept wondering what happened here. I was under the impression that the parkour would be the conductive element for the assassinating part to blossom, that I will have to zip and zap and jump and climb and bounce my way through an area to reach my mark. But that is not the game that I played. It's not bad per se, you do a lot of climbing, but climbing isn't parkour. Once again, I have to repeat myself and call it as it is. It's basic, it's plain, it's boring. Not only due to the simplistic implementation of the stealth elements, such as the lighting makes you more or less visible, or the possibility of going prone, but because there is actually little parkour to be done in the game. Maybe this is a consequence of me not having played any previous entries, sure. Maybe the parkour has always been like this, and while some people might enjoy it, it's just not for me. I guess that's another thing that I'm looking forward to when I get to play all the other games. Gameplay-wise, and we'll get to the narrative in a moment, this is what I was most disappointed with the game. When I thought of playing Assassin's Creed, the little I had seen throughout the years involved the characters using their environment to their advantage, whether it was climbing a wall to escape from a group of enemies, or using the rooftops to locate a mark that is escaping. Think of every instance of parkour that you might have seen in real life, whether it was in a movie or a YouTube video, or perhaps in person if you're into this. This movement style was born as a way to traverse a city, using its features to your advantage. But Age Shadows lacks so much verticality that the parkour just isn't allowed to shine. By becoming an open world game, the map has become wide but flat. You can and will get into many rooftops, sure, but there's no creativity or physical place for the parkour fantasy to blossom, at least not on the level that I thought it would. And well, that is a stealth gameplay, sure, but it's far from the only element available. I am not asking the game to be Hitman, where you can disguise as pretty much anything to wait and hide amongst the crowd, nor do I want it to be like Dishonored with its magical powers. But for a game that I thought emphasized stealth, perhaps I was expecting a bit too much. One major gripe I have with the stealth system is the inability to control day and night cycles. Hey, Post-Video J here. While I was giving the final touches to the video, Ubisoft came out with a new roadmap for the game, and one of the features was precisely allowing you to set the time of the day to either dawn or dusk. This was going to be my following point, which is now pointless, so if you want to skip it, feel free to go ahead to the next time tab. It will not surprise anyone to know that sneaking in using the cover of darkness is much easier done during the night. The game uses a 48 real-life minute cycle, 24 minutes for the day, 24 minutes for the night. Of course, wanting to embody the shinobi experience, you want to wait for the night before sneaking into an enemy camp. But what if you just happen to arrive right as the sun rises? Do you wait, or do you keep going? Well, honestly, you can just keep going since the stealth would be a little bit harder, but unless you're playing the highest difficulty settings, it shouldn't be an issue. But what if you want to wait? Well, then you're out of luck because there is no way. This is such a shame, and a problem that was solved decades ago in games like The Witcher 3 or Morrowind Hell, even Majora's Mask had a way to let time pass back in 1998 that I can understand why they didn't implement this option. It's not like there's any agency in taking a few hours of waiting, narratively speaking, considering that canonically the game takes place over many months as the seasons change. There is such a great in-game justification for it too in the form of the kakurega, or safe houses. Most locations you come across have one of these, a small house that operates as a hub for fast traveling. Narratively, it is a place where to lay low, and what better place to wait until the night than this? Anyway, what if you don't want to engage in some lightweight skullduggery? Or what if you get caught and have to stand your ground? I was under the impression that combat in Assassin's Creed sucked, that it was a stand around and wait for the enemy to come hit you then tearing counterattack ordeal. At least for much of the original entries. It has vastly improved since then, and I had a good time fighting through enemies' ranks. I do wish the game had a bit more enemy variety though. Enemies can be dangerous in groups, and I died more times than I would like to publicly admit. But once you have raided your first couple of castles, you will have encountered the vast majority of enemies you will fight throughout the rest of the game. The only major change will be the weapons they wield, and even then, this only results in slight variations of movesets. As for your own weapons, the game has a skill tree for each different one you can wield, which is 3 for Nao and 5 for Yasuke. And it does a relatively good job in differentiating them with active skills and bonuses. Each weapon has different movesets, so there's some involvement in how each fight conducts itself, and the takedowns, while might get repetitive, are fun enough. This is the part that I enjoyed the most, gameplay-wise, since it was the first time I felt that the game allowed me a real choice and committed to it. I did feel, however, that the whole combat is a little bit muddied by the weapon tiers, as well as the leveling system. Since the game is also part RPG, each piece of gear has a level assigned to it, and if you don't keep up with it, you quickly fall behind in terms of stats. It's not like you cannot finish the game without properly leveled gear, but it will certainly take you more time since you become increasingly frail while enemies do more damage. This also has some ramifications for finishing main story quests, but we'll discuss them a bit later. As per the leveling system, here's where I have to bring up the temples that I mentioned earlier. In Ancient Shadows, you gain mastery points by completing certain tasks, such as completing missions or doing some open world activities like Kujikiri, a rhythmic minigame where you have to memorize a set of inputs and keep pressing them even after the prompts are gone from the screen. Or horse archery challenges, which remind me a lot of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask. There are other activities, and the reward for finishing most of them is a mastery point that you can use to learn new abilities. The worst offender of these activities are clearing temples, for lack of a better definition. Almost every temple you come across has one of two dull, repetitive, and pace-breaking activities. Either you go find specific shrines and press F to pay your respects, or tumble your way around to find lost pages. They are both asinine activities, and unfortunately, they're also where you gain the bulk of your mastery points, since temples are plentiful. What is probably worse is that these locations are often beautiful renditions that I wish could have been used in a more interesting way. Some temples have enemies in them that you can either kill or avoid, but those are few and far between. Another system that the game does not need is the crafting elements. Having to scrounge for resources or spend time disassembling your previous gear is not quite my cup of tea. Something which most open world games insist on having, yet barely bother making it an engaging part of the game. At least it is helpful since it allows you to keep the equipment you find early on, and upgrading it is dirt cheap for the most part. Also, you find some pretty busted armor for both Nao and Yasuke fairly early on, which is what I use for the vast majority of the game. I feel like I have been rambling for too long about some of the game systems, and I haven't even touched the story elements yet, so I'll just briefly go over the objective board, my other big gripe with the system elements. I thought it was such a great element the first time it was shown. It's a neat circle showing you the main antagonists, ready for you to scratch them off one by one as you take your vengeance. However, soon after the main one, a new one appears. Then another one, and another one. At this stage is when I realized that what initially felt a pretty unique system was just your regular video game journal, where instead of entries in a list, you have circles filled with people to assassinate. It's mostly a neat visual redesign of how quests are usually displayed in a video game, which is nice to see, but I really thought it would pack more of a punch. At least I had the option to take care of business in the order I wanted, and I did, although the game encourages you to follow a curated path by getting missions behind higher level enemies. You can still do them, but as I mentioned earlier, the lack of high level equipment turns the affair into a chore. Therefore, you should follow the intended way. That will be fine and all, but unfortunately, it causes one unintended consequence that will prevail throughout the game. But to make sense of it, I had to stop talking about the game mechanics and start talking about the narrative. What about the story? Does the narrative hold up? Is it what I expected from an Assassin's Creed game? My idea of an Assassin's Creed story is one that blends real historical elements with unique characters to create believable historical fiction, where the plot occurs in parallel to the events it mimics. The most famous element is obviously the Assassin's Order, clad in their white robes throughout the ages. The second one will be the futuristic plotline that intertwines with historical events, although in what capacity I couldn't say. It is the part that I was most interested in, since the combination of sci-fi and history is right up my alley, and I haven't seen explored too much in other games I've played. Unfortunately, after having rolled credits and finishing the epilogue, it seems this aspect of the story will remain shrouded in mystery. The game barely covers anything related to the Animus, save a very brief appearance within the very beginning and quite later on for some quite quick info dump. Perhaps Ubisoft wants to lean more heavily on the old historic authenticity for future entries, and this is them winning down the futuristic elements. A pity, I guess, but after 14 games I can see why they will take this route. So, what about the historical elements? Well, I'll begin by prefacing that I am no Japanese history expert. I know pretty much nothing of the events and characters that happen throughout the game, and when I do, it's mostly due to exposure from other media set in feudal Japan, but only the very basic stuff. Expertise is not required to keep up with the plot, although reading through about some of the locations and characters after finishing the game provides a very interesting context to the events happening throughout the game. As I assume previous games did, you are thrown right in the middle of a boiling pot where fiction weaves with reality. In Icy Shadows, this reality is known as the Sengoku Jidai, perhaps Japan's most famous era outside of modern history. Assassin's Creed Shadows feature dual protagonists. On one hand we have Fujibayashi Naoe, representing the assassin side. On the other one we have Yasuke, an African slave turned samurai which is serving under Oda Nobunaga. He has a tenuous connection with the Templars, although surprisingly this isn't explored until very late into the game. In fact, most of Yasuke's involvement in the plot is tangential, and there is a strong case to be made that the actual protagonist of the game is Naoe. It is her who we play as for most of the early parts of the game, and who is tied most directly with the story's inciting incident. The stakes are very personal for Naoe, but not so much for Yasuke, who mostly seems to strung along for no particular good reason. The game is split into 3 acts. The first one starts during Nobunaga's invasion of the Iga province, which is now his home, and it's where the main villains are introduced. The Shinbakufu, 12 masked characters that appear in the middle of the night, heralded by a mix of modern and Japanese music, in a moment greatly inspired by Kurosawa's filmography, with a dash of Tarantino for good measure. They take a mysterious box that Naose's family were guarding, gravely injuring her and killing her father. This is an inciting incident that will propel the whole plot forwards, get revenge and recover the box. We do not know what's in the box, only that we are honor-bound to retrieve it and return it to a safe place, and that it must never be opened. The first hours of the game follow a very thorough path. After you fail to retrieve the box and your father dies, you are saved by a priest and his pupil, a kid named Junjiro, who will play a small but important role as a symbol of growth and forgiveness. From here, the game expands into its main structure, hunting down Shinbakufu. Crucially, Yasuke is nowhere to be seen during this first act, which can last many hours if you do some of the side quests or other activities in between. Eventually, though, the events of the story unfold into real-life events, into Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, the place where Oda Nobunaga was betrayed and died. The game slowly sets you out to be at the center of the historic event, being fooled into thinking that Nobunaga himself was the man responsible for your father's death. And here is when we finally cross paths with Yasuke. This bridge between the first and second act is where the game begins to stumble, in my opinion. When Naoe is about to kill Nobunaga, Yasuke arrives to save him, and the fight erupts. Naoe was forced to use her hidden blade, which Yasuke immediately recognized, hinting at a connection between him and the assassins. The game hangs a lantern on it, but soon enough the story reunites them both and the mystery grows even larger. How does Yasuke know of the hidden blade? Is he an assassin in secret or related to them somehow? He speaks as if he knows more than he lets on, saying how they are both part of something larger, something that they are both seeking but don't know yet. The reason he wants to join Naoe is to see where things go, since he's convinced their fates are intertwined without actually revealing why. There are two major issues here. The most immediate one is the poor characterization that this sequence portrays. Remember, Yasuke was Nobunaga's retainer. It is him who you first controlled during the invasion of Naose's village, cutting down many of her people, including her master and clan leader, Momochi Sendayu, who, fun fact, was one of Japan's greatest ninjas according to legend. At first, Naoe is furious at the proposal of working together. After all, she has every reason to want Yasuke dead. The only reason she stops is because of Junjiro. Naoe ended up taking care of Junjiro, but during Yasuke and Naoe's second encounter, he reveals that the reason he's an orphan is because Naoe killed his father. Won't you believe it, he's actually the son of the first Shinpakufu member that you assassinated. Unfortunately, the writing doesn't develop this dramatic tension well enough to support the dynamic between the characters. In the span of literally 10 minutes, Naoe has accepted Yasuke and everything is cool between them now. The second issue isn't apparent until many hours later, and we'll get to it in a moment. The second act of the game consists of you going around assassinating the rest of the Shinpakufu. You finally have full control of where to go and the order in which to tackle your missions, although the game attempts to guide you to a particular route by curving the level requirements of most main missions. At first, I thought the degree of freedom this allowed was great, but it turned out to be a double-edged sword. See, the game does not keep track of the progress you make, narratively speaking, so each interaction with a Shinpakufu member is an isolated event rather than part of a continuous narrative. It doesn't matter if you have already killed several of their members. None of them seem to react to you, or the decimation of their organization, or any other events from the plot. There is no permanence to your actions, which is a shame, since nothing of what you accomplish seems to matter at all. None of these missions move the needle even a bit. This is because of a weird shift that happens right after Naoe and Yasuke begin working together. Suddenly, the scope of their mission changes from "I want to avenge my father and recover the stolen box" to "We will do what is best for Japan." So, most missions from then on focus on a particular region and how you are going to get rid of the Shinpakufu member that is making a move to gain control of it, usually by some nefarious means, and pave the way for someone else to take that spot instead, usually by some nefarious means. By this point, it was obvious that the plot of the game didn't satisfy the length requirements, and instead of adjusting it, Ubisoft turned the whole second act into padding. I am not joking when I say that you can cut 90% of it and the plot could proceed without any issues whatsoever. At most, you lose a bit of characterization and some interesting scenes here and there, but that's it. It is one way to increase the number of hours it takes to beat the game, sure, but it is hardly the correct way to go about it. It is only at the tail end of it, when only the last two Shinbakufu members are pending a visit, that the game apparently realizes that there has been absolutely no progress made in the last 20 hours. So, to proceed with the main plot, first it forces you to do some of Naoe and Yasuke's story missions, which for the most part have been flashbacks to flesh out the characters a bit. You have to understand that you are perfectly aware of who the next target is. In fact, it's the only Shinbakufu member you've been aware of for the whole second act of the game, but it does not let you act on it. If now that he's your only lead, you are forced on a different path instead. While the timing couldn't be worse, at least the game finally tackles some of the mysteries that have been clumsily laid out during the first hours of the game, never to be touched again. On Naoe's side, you get to know more about the Assassin's Order, how it made its way into Japan, and her family's involvement in the whole ordeal. Yasuke, on the other hand, will experience the Templar side of the coin. It is a tangential intervention since, as far as I am aware, he has no idea what or who the Templars are, but he's come across them before. Turns out they were the ones who slaved him and his family. So when he learns that his Portuguese captor is somewhere nearby, he goes on a hunting spree, culminating in one of the best boss fights in the whole game. Unfortunately, this side of his story is once again cut short, since after this small peek into Naoe and Yasuke's backstory, the game redirects you back to hunting the Shinbakufu. Because why bother landing the plane right when you can keep doing loops, am I right? Remember that second issue I referenced a while ago, when Naoe and Yasuke banded together? This is it. Yasuke's introduction was loaded in secrecy and promises of something else going on. Something larger than both of them, as he put it back then. Me, a newcomer to the series, took it that it will have some involvement with the overall plot of the series, namely the beef between assassins and Templars, or perhaps even the mysterious Animus, which has been completely sidelined thus far. And here we are, almost at the end of the game, at least story-wise, and nothing new has been revealed on this front. It feels like a disingenuous move, where the writers hung a lamp on it, and when it came time to talk about it, they simply took it away and gaslighted everyone into thinking it wasn't even that big of a deal. Unfortunately for me, for you the player, and for the characters in the story, the rest of the plot will proceed in the same way, like a hastily wrapped gift bought after forgetting a birthday. You'll get to open the gift, but it comes a day too late and the presentation is messy. It has missed the mark. I consider Act 3 the part from hunting the last two Shinbakufu members to the epilogue. It is a surprisingly short stretch. After finally dealing with Akechi Mitsuhide, you learn the identity of the last one. Here the game decides to forego a grand finale, at least gameplay-wise, to try and bridge edgy shadows with themes of earlier Assassin's Creed, mainly Assassin and Templar orders. The head of the Shinbakufu waits you at a courtyard alone. It is none other than Ashikaga Yoshiaki. If this doesn't ring a bell, don't worry, you're not alone. He made a brief appearance during one of your other missions, but otherwise he is pretty much non-existent. This is one of those times where actually being familiar with the actual events of this era pays off. You see, Yoshiaki is the previous shogun, the one that Oda Nobunaga overthrew in his campaign to Japanese reunification. Yoshiaki, who of course wants his position back, formed the Shinbakufu to start working on that end and oppose Nobunaga's expansion. The game doesn't explicitly tell you this, but it is heavily implied that is the reason for its existence. Yoshiaki, presumably through his connections as a shogun, learned of the existence of the Templars and wanted his support. In exchange, they wanted the Imperial Regalia. Whether it's for their supernatural status or plain market price, it's never revealed. So when word got out of the location of one of them, Yoshiaki gathered his masked band and headed to Iga to retrieve it. Look, I could go into many details as to why this part of the story is very poorly executed, but we're at the end, so let's just power through it. Yoshiaki, now without the power of his conspirator band, is armed only with knowledge that he uses leverage to keep his head on his shoulders. For Naoe, he offers her confirmation that there is another assassin doing the rounds, a woman wearing the same hidden blade as hers, and gives a possible lead about where to find her. For Yasuke, he offers the breadcrumbs that will lead to Nunokado, the leader of the Templars in Japan and the one that once enslaved Yasuke and his family. And thus we end the Shinbakufu saga, which had much promise but ran out of steam almost as quickly as they were introduced. It is a shame, as the concept was very promising, but it turned out to be pretty inconsequential. What follows then is pure cliffhanger material. So, Yasuke ends up tracking down Nuno Karo, and we learn that he and Duarte de Melo, whom we already tracked and killed earlier, both killed Yasuke's mother. Why? Presumably because they found them in Nuno Karo's cabin holding some Templar documents, which Yasuke's mother had accidentally dropped, just clinging. But the game seems to frame the situation as getting caught red-handed. If it wasn't already suspicious, after Nuno Karo shoots Yasuke's mother, suddenly an assassin appears on the boat and starts wreaking havoc. Why is there an assassin on this boat? Is she even an assassin? Well, she is clearly a she, and she sacrifices her life to save Yasuke, who takes the chance to plunge into the ocean. Yet, what are the odds that one of them was on the boat? Were they following the Templars? Were they working with Yasuke's family? Of course, the game won't explain any of this. You take care of Nuno Karo, Yasuke proclaims war on the Templars, and that's the end of it. Naoe, on the other hand, arrives at the assassin's main base in Japan, which had been hidden from prying eyes for ages. Inside, she discovers the assassin's banner with famous logo, and the resting place where the Imperial regalia are meant to be safeguarded. She leaves the one they recovered there, and on her way out she is faced with Hattori Hanzo, who was following her. Turns out he just recovered another one of the regalias, which, and I wish I was making this up, did it by asking nicely. Hanzo makes it abundantly clear that he believes Tsuyu, Naose's mother, is still alive, but not before having to get something else off his chest. He was in love with Tsuyu, but she chose Nagato over him. So in his rage he leaked the location of the Imperial regalia and thus kickstarted the events of the plot. He seems very nonchalant about the whole affair, calmly explaining his actions but not taking any responsibility over it. Not one that now I can offer to consider satisfying, at least. You are offered the choice one last time, spare or kill Hattori Hanzo. I chose spare because by this time I wasn't in the mood for yet another boss fight that would probably have no effect on the narrative whatsoever. And in a sense, I have come to agree with the only plot thread that seemed to have a permeating effect over the whole narrative, which is that vengeance for the sake of vengeance is not the best way to restore the country. Blood makes for a poor foundation after all. Imagine my surprise when I check on YouTube what happens if you select kill and see that after you fight and beat him, Naoe spares him anyway, and the same cutscene triggers. And so the credit rolls with a vague promise that mostly feels set up for future DLC, or an actual sequel. Of course, this being an open world game that sells you in-game currency for actual money, rolling credits doesn't mean that you are done. There are many quests left for you to do if you desire. I decided to call it quits for now. After all, the story was the only thing moving me forward, and without it, there isn't much of a point to keep playing. Now that we are at the end, what have I learned about Assassin's Creed as a whole? Was this a worthy investment of my time? Well, as I said before, it was a bit of a stretch to assume that one game will be enough to catch up with such a prolific series. Most of my main questions remain unanswered, like what's the beef between Assassins and Templars, or what the heck is an Animus, or what is the deal with that weird beginning? Assassin's Creed Shadows has been but a peek behind the curtain, and in that sense, well, there was no catching up to do. But let's be honest, no one has ever claimed Assassin's Creed to be one of gaming's greatest stories. Most of its praise has always been regarding the use of historical elements and its gameplay. I can't really judge how well or how far-fetched historical elements are, since how most of my knowledge of the Sengoku era, and all of Japan's history really, come from films, manga, and other video games. But it seems credible enough, particularly if you selected the Japanese voiceover. It's a shame that, as with most of the game, it is a shallow representation that doesn't dig deep or utilize mechanisms that will elevate its uniqueness, the beautiful yet familiar strangeness of Japanese media, to tell a story more representative of the setting. I can't help but compare it with Ghost of Tsushima, who not only beat Ubisoft to the punch in terms of releasing an open-world game set in Japan, but also told a very unique story that blended many elements of Japanese literature, particularly in its ending. When Ghost of Tsushima was released, many people were stumped about how Western Studio was able to capture the essence of Japan so remarkably well, including Toshihiro Nagoshi, the creator of the Yakuza. They were expecting an Assassin's Creed Shadows, a surface-level coat of painting spread over the wall, but leaving the lop marks of someone who didn't quite know what they were doing. I know this seems harsh, and Ghost of Tsushima isn't without faults itself, but when comparing both of them, it is clear which game utilizes the setting best. xShadows gameplay is basic. It is a shame that the map has lost the verticality and density that will make the parkour stand more, as well as the element it was replaced with, which is the boring open world, the basic side quests, and the rudimentary inventory system, which are a poor consolation prize. I did have fun with the game, but I would have appreciated more if the adventure hadn't dragged for so long and had a more satisfying payout, which I knew was a common complaint for about AC Valhalla, the previous open world entry in the series. In fact, while playing the game, I was often reminded by a Rock Paper Shotgun article where the author mentioned, quote, "I don't really know what bigger or smaller mean in a video game, and I'm not sure anybody else does either," unquote. It's a sentiment that I have come to share, since games like Horizon Zero Dawn or AC Shadows had insufferable maps, not only because they were smaller, as Ubisoft called it, but because they felt empty. Pretty, but empty. And there's only so much time one can stare into a beautiful landscape before starting abusing the fast travel features. Outside of the game itself, AC Shadows has made me watch Ubisoft more closely. I already knew it had a bad reputation in the past, but events like the recent sexual harassment trial really painted a bad light into what might have been the working conditions throughout the development of the game. And while I recommend everyone to read it, it's not an easy one. Then you have Tencent's pseudo-acquisition, for which Ubisoft started laying people off left and right in order to appear more palatable to investors. A trend is still ongoing, with the sunsetting of xDefiant being made definitive just a few weeks ago. It is a hard prospect to get excited about the series when you understand that AC Shadows was meant to be it, the one that got all the attention and budget, and yet the final product ended up being simply alright. Come to think of it, before AC Shadows, games like Star Wars Outlaws or Avatars or Pandora probably were in the same position, and as far as I can tell, both games were as average as AC Shadows. Now, I realize that I might be overly harsh about the game. Let me make this clear, I don't think AC Shadows is a bad game. I don't think it's a particularly good one either. It's a perfectly average video game, one that I enjoyed playing for most of the time, and while it didn't captivate me as part of the Assassin's Creed franchise, I do recognize now how its systems can feel satisfying enough to warrant the tremendous time investment it requires. I may come back to Assassin's Creed Shadows one day, perhaps to give it a second chance after I caught up with the rest of the series. Assassin's Creed is a long one, and judging by its success, I don't think it's bold to say that it has earned a certain amount of grace and popularity for a reason. I'm not looking for the perfect games that I have missed in the last decade, nor do I intend to try absolutely everything under the sun, but I can't deny that there is a certain charm about Assassin's Creed. Will it last given Ubisoft's current direction? Will the series keep flourishing after AC Shadows' commercial success? That is a question for the future. But for now, I can say that I am satisfied after having tried Assassin's Creed for my first time.